Anyone who has picked up a second language, or third or fourth, as I imagine several of you have, knows that the devil is in the details. Understanding a native speaker requires a grasp of subtle differences. Vocabulary gets very specific. This week I've been thinking about, in the English language, the difference between the verb to hear and to listen. Though they're very closely related, hearing and listening mean two very different things. When I was growing up, my household was pretty busy. If my mom might not be listening to this podcast eventually, I would say chaotic, but we'll call it busy. We were involved in sports. There were often friends around. My brother and I also watched plenty of television. He played video games quite a bit. I've never been into them. They stress me out. The point is, there was a lot of competition for our attention. In retrospect, I see how frustrating that must have been for my mom and her attempts to communicate, to get us to do very basic things. At some point in the parenting journey, she developed the basic, specific tool when she wanted to be listened to. Of course, we could hear her talking, but we were too busy watching or playing or coloring or building or doing whatever interested us at the time. We would hear just enough to nod our heads and say, yeah, Mom. She's pretty easygoing. But at some point, if the communication was important, she would say, "Look at me." That was her way of ensuring that we at least paused what we were doing at the moment. It was her attempt to convert us from hearing her voice to actually listening to what she was saying. Look at me. And finally, after we looked, she would tell us what she needed us to know. The busyness of the Doss household has not slowed down. When we're together for holidays with my brother's two kids running around and television always on, food always being cooked in the kitchen, there is still plenty of distraction. One day a few years ago, my brother was planning dinner for the lot of us. He was talking about some ingredients that he needed from the store. My mom was, of course, occupied with grandkids, because I have learned most grandparents will drop anything to spend one more minute with the grandkids. And there it came, out of the cacophony of the household, "Mom, look at me. When you go to the store, I need eggs." She knew two things. The eggs were important, and at least we had managed to listen to something over those 18 years of trying to communicate. All this month, we're focused on the act of listening in our worship services. This Sunday, we're particularly focused on listening to ourself, that still small voice within. The reading today was about the power of deeply listening to others. It holds within it a lesson about listening to our own inner voice too. Remember, the writer spoke about a friend who had been ill. The friend was interrupted so many times and so often by people interjecting their own story of commonality, thereby making the conversation about them, that this friend stopped talking. I think our still small voice within can sometimes react the same way as a person who is not being listened to by others. If we cut off that internal voice, interrupt it, ignore it enough, after a while it can stop trying to make itself heard. Forgetting to play with your muse every once in a while is the death of creativity. ignoring your sense of humor, your compassion, your sense of adventure, ignoring those beautiful innate human desires lets them shrivel away. Of course, that's not the only way that people respond when they aren't being listened to. The opposite can also be true. When we aren't listened to or ignored or interrupted repeatedly, some of us react in a much more forward way. Instead of getting quiet, we get louder, and we might get angry, and much, much louder. We might get irrational and start yelling. You get my point. Taking time to listen to your inner voice isn't just about sunshine and rainbows. Listening to our inner voice is a foundation of emotional intelligence. Not listening runs the risk of squandering our unique inspiration and insights as they wither from neglect, or perhaps more often runs the risk of letting those unattended emotions get magnified until they are yelling and taking over in unpredictable ways. And here's the key about listening that applies across the board. Whether we're listening to that inner voice or to someone else, perhaps someone we disagree with or someone we love, it doesn't mean doing what the other person wants necessarily. Listening just means sincerely trying to understand. So listening to our inner voice could look like a couple of different things. It could mean taking that beautiful wisdom from deep inside and turning it into action or art, or embracing that blessing of inspiration. Or sometimes our inner voice is speaking from a hurt, unhealthy, or immature place. Too often we react by ignoring it or shutting it up or trying to change that voice. I want to invite us into a different option. Consider responding with gentle compassion. I hear you. I appreciate why you feel angry and sad. And we are not going to do what you're asking for right now. We're not going to yell or have that third drink or buy that pretty new thing that we can't afford. But I do hear you. I know that all sounds squishy and a little bit vague. So let me talk a little more concretely. For, I would say, the past 20 years, I have invested more and more in listening to my inner voice, to my emotions, and how my core self responds to nature and to the world around me. Writing this, I tried to put a start date, and I realized that I'd been attempting to lean into listening deeply to myself for around 20 years, and I'm still not great at it. I still have to pause to set aside quiet time and a place to check in with myself, to actually recognize what I'm feeling. Perhaps that's a biological predisposition. I think more likely it's a massive, lifelong effort to balance out the obsession with logic and control that is so fundamental to European, male, colonial, educated, professional life. This project to listen more fully to myself is a quest to reclaim what I am entitled to be more fully human. Perhaps many of you are more self-aware than I. You are grounded and in touch with the kaleidoscope of emotions playing out in the moment. For me, it takes effort. That usually looks like setting aside about 20 minutes to be quiet with myself. In the past, it's looked like yoga or therapy or wilderness adventures or prayer and a few other woo-woo activities, but mostly it looks like meditation. There are lots of ways of practicing deep listening to that still small voice. There's a huge variety of meditation. I promise you, there's a whole buffet of different styles and postures and schools and traditions to choose from. Explore. Find one that feels the best fit for you. And it's not about getting it right. It's mostly about just doing it. More recently, I've been learning about an incredibly famous book, The Artist's Way. Some of you have probably encountered it. It recommends a practice of morning pages. It's a daily journal filling out 3 pages with just a stream of consciousness. Just keep the pen moving even if you're writing nonsense. The goal is not to be wise or profound. It's not to outline a goal list or a deep dive. The goal of morning pages is simply to get the mental gunk unstuck and out of the way so that you can move forward. It's not unlike the listening that was recommended in the reading. Don't try to have an answer or make sense of it. Just be present and willing to hold whatever arises. It is courageous, rare, and powerful, that type of listening, to make space for whatever comes up. If journaling is your jam, you can try tapping into that different part of your brain by writing with your left hand. Or try writing from someone else's perspective in the situation. Or writing a letter that you never intend to send. Or perhaps a letter to someone who has passed away or is no longer available in your life. Like meditation, there are tons of different ways of journaling. One of the more woo-woo practices of listening deeply is dream work. Reverend Judy Tomlinson at the Anaheim congregation is well versed in this practice. It helps to keep a journal by your bed so you can record those dreams. We all forget them pretty quickly, but if you record them, you have something to work with. You can ask yourself some questions. If I had to give this dream a title, what would it be? What was the predominant feeling in this dream? Who were the main characters? Were there symbols or animals or colors that emerged? In my humble opinion, this is not literal. That was a sign. Sign from the dream world. Thank you, Jeff. Balance is important. It's not literal or scientific, and it's a great opportunity to work with symbols and create meaning out of the raw material that your brains have generated. It reminds me of those refrigerator magnet poetry from years ago. Use that stuff. Arrange it in a way that makes sense to you. Finally, for the fall, I will remind you of what I recommended in Tapestry's October newsletter. Try doing nothing. And I mean literally nothing, not reading or crafting or looking at your phones or even meditating or looking at nature. Just give your heart and mind the space to come forward into the openness. Just 5 minutes is a good start. This week, I watched a new documentary film. Some of you may have seen it. I'm not sure how long it's been out, but Will and Harper on Netflix. Netflix describes it this way, quote, "When Will Ferrell's good friend, Harper, comes out as a transgender woman, they take a road trip to bond and reintroduce Harper to the country as her true self. I was skeptical at first, but in the end, I was blown away. The film offers surprising depth and vulnerability for such a complex subject. Harper had been a writer for Saturday Night Live for decades, and she was responsible for much of Will Ferrell's comedic identity, that absurdity. They had a 30-year collaboration and friendship. Much to everyone's surprise, Harper was able to come out as a transgender woman in her early 60s. Of course, it was not an easy journey for her. The film talks frankly about her loneliness and gender dysphoria and even considering taking her own life. The thing that makes this movie a little bit different is Harper's journey is accompanied by Will Ferrell's vulnerability and honesty. He also talks frankly about the nervousness of renegotiating a 30-year friendship and the difficulty of hearing his friends struggle and witnessing the ridicule she experiences as a transgender woman. It's especially striking to see Will Ferrell, the comedian that we know for his really absurd humor, to set aside that armor of jokes to be real with us about his friend. The film is fundamentally about figuring out how to be your authentic self and how to be an ally to someone who is on a hard journey. I bring all this up to point out that listening to that still small voice within is real and powerful. Having courage to listen for the voice within is part of everyone's journey. It's especially challenging, though, for those whose voice is contradictory to the outside world. That could be about understanding our own gender. It could be about following a true vocation. It could be about our romantic inclinations or lack thereof. It could be about knowing deep down that we were meant to live in a different place, that somewhere else is home. This Friday, October 11th, is National Coming Out Day. Since 1988, the LGBTQ community has recognized the day as a celebration of the journey of coming out as your magnificent, unique, wonderful self. Perhaps we all can join the celebration a bit this year, listening more closely to that still small voice within to learn what it has to teach us. I want to leave you this morning with a quote from the late Thich Nhat Hanh. For too long, I dismissed Thich Nhat Hanh as an old Buddhist monk that wasn't really attached to the here and now. But I learned more recently how he witnessed tremendous suffering in Vietnam during decades of colonial manufactured civil war there. He helped numerous refugees survive, and he himself had a complicated journey immigrating to the United States and France. He knows a thing or two about having some messy voices inside. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "By listening compassionately to yourself, you have started to come home to yourself. Going home requires only sitting down and being with yourself, accepting the situation as it is. Yes, it might be a mess in there, but we accept it because we know we have left home for a long time. So now we're home. with our in-breath and our out-breath, our mindful breathing, we begin to tidy up our homes. So may it be. Amen.